Hey everybody, it's me, Mr. Wells. Nice to see all of you. We have a few more students than usual joining us because we got our regular remote students and we have a few other students who have gone remote for various reasons in the last few days. And so I am recording this today for you. If you are an actual remote student, if you're in the remote classroom, then this video is going to be posted in your classroom along with an assignment and some materials that go with it. There'll be questions over this story. We're going to be doing narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. There's also the unit notes that you're going to need to be taking as well. If you are in one of my other classes, but you are just currently remote because you're under quarantine, those things are actually going to be posted separately under the materials, but you will need to get those and get that all figured out here. So you should be able to pretty easily access those things if you don't have access to them. And if you have any questions, just email me and let me know if you need help finding something. We're starting a new unit called A Move Toward Freedom. It's about the Civil War. I'm going to post on, again, on Google Classroom, a video. It's a crash course in history, and I want you to pause this video of me and take some time to watch it. It's about a 13-minute video and gives you an introduction to what the Civil War is. Now, you studied the Civil War in history last year in the 7th grade. But I know that, it's been a long time. We forget things. I also know, I think that was a unit you might have been in when we went to quarantine. So it was really kind of a tumultuous spring last year. Tumultuous, that's a pretty big word, don't you think, Ms. Torres?
Yes.
Yeah, well, it was a pretty tough spring last year. So go ahead and take a minute. Watch that video and pause this, watch that video on the crash course, and then we're going to start this story about Frederick Douglass. Okay, so now you probably watched that video, and now we're going to be reading from this story, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. Now, with this story, I only have one entry in your notes so far, and it's going to be under autobiography. Autobiography. I want you to write the definition of autobiography down because this is an excerpt, it's just part, we're only reading part of it, from a book by Frederick Douglass, who was a slave. And after he gained his freedom, he wrote this book. But an autobiography, and here's the definition, an account of the writer's own life, featuring real people and actual events. An account of the writer's life featuring real people and actual events. Now, you might remember that in the last unit we were talking about memoirs. Okay, remember we talked about memoirs, we talked about personal essays, and there's a lot of overlap there, but the difference comes in the amount of information that's being shared. A lot of times a personal essay will just take one incident from a person's life and he'll choose that incident and use it to share an opinion about something. Okay, that would be a personal essay. A little bit bigger is a memoir. A memoir tells about personal experiences, recounts a person's life, but it might not give all the details. So for example, when I retire, and if I write a story about, or I write a book about my time as an 8th grade teacher. I could write all about the students I had, wonderful paraprofessionals that we have here, and I could write all sorts of things. But I probably wouldn't talk about my birth, where I grew up, because that wouldn't be part of the story. The memoir would be just about my life as a teacher. But if I want to do an autobiography, I'd expand it and I'd be talking about my whole life. I'd include a part about being a teacher, my family, where I grew up, all of those things that make up my life. So that is an autobiography, and you want to write that down: autobiography, an account of the writer's own life, featuring real people and actual events. Okay, so this is by Frederick Douglass. When he wrote this, slavery was still legal in many states. You had the North and the South. Slavery was legal throughout most of the South, or actually through all of the South, and in some places in the North as well. But in the North, there were a lot of people who had never experienced slavery for themselves. They'd heard about slavery. They kind of knew that it was a bad thing, but they didn't know much about it. Well, he writes this book to describe what it's like to be a slave, because he himself grew up as a slave. As we're reading it, you'll see that he refers to master and mistress. These are terms that were used in those days to talk about slave owners. So in this case, you have a husband and wife who were his owners. I know it seems strange for us to even think about you being able to own a human being, but that really is sort of the gruesome part of all this, is to even think that you would think that. But people thought that then. You've got the husband and wife are his owners. The husband he calls master, and the wife he calls mistress. So let's read it together. I lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. I had no regular teacher. My mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, had, in compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct, but had set her face against my being instructed by anyone else. It is due, however, to my mistress to say of her that she did not adopt this course of treatment immediately. She at first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. It was at least necessary for her to have some training in the exercise of irresponsible power, to make her equal to the task of treating me as though I were a brute. My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. In entering upon the duties of a slaveholder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained to her the relation of a mere chattel, and that for her to treat me as a human being was not only wrong, but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. So he describes this woman, his mistress, his owner, and when you think about it, think to yourself, is he describing her in positive terms or negative terms? I think it's positive, for the most part, positive. But there's a change that takes place in her. And he says that slavery is just as injurious to her as it is to me. In other words, it's just as bad for the slave owner as it is for your slave. Do you think it's bad being a slave? Well, the answer is yes, right? I mean, you would not want to lose your freedom. You would not want to be beaten for not doing something by someone else. You would not want to even have your own life at the mercy of someone else. But as bad as it was for slaves, also, Frederick Douglass says, bad for the slave owners, because it corrupted them. It made them into something different than what they were originally. He goes on, when I went there, she was a pious, warm, and tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering for which she had not a tear. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities. Under its influence, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. So think about it. Here he says, if there was somebody hungry, she gave him food. If there's somebody need clothing, she gave him clothes. She was pious. That means that she said her prayers, she was religious. And he also says that if there were people who were mourning, meaning they were sad because someone died, she went and comforted them. I mean, this is a really great woman. But slavery made her into a monster. Okay? It made her so that she did not treat him like the human being that he should. The first step in her downward course was in her ceasing to instruct me. She now commenced to practice her husband's precepts. She finally became even more violent in her opposition than her husband himself. She was not satisfied with simply doing as well as he had commanded. She seemed anxious to do better. Nothing seemed to make her more angry than to see me with a newspaper. She seemed to think that here lay the danger. I have had her rush at me with a face made all up of fury and snatch from me a newspaper in a manner that fully revealed her apprehension. She was an apt woman, and a little experience soon demonstrated to her satisfaction that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. So, we don't even know if he was reading the newspaper. Maybe the newspaper was just delivered. He went to get it for master. She sees him with the newspaper, gets angry, and snatches it right from him because she doesn't want him to read. The thing about reading is that it can open up a whole new world for you. It can broaden your horizons. It can teach you things about the world that you never knew. And they knew this. It's true. In fact, in many southern states at this time, it was against the law to teach a slave how to read or to give a book to a slave. They did not want slaves getting to a position where they would know enough about the world to rebel against their masters. From this time, I was most narrowly watched. If I was in a separate room any considerable length of time, I was sure to be suspected of having a book, and was at once called to give an account of myself. All this, however, was too late. The first step had been taken. Mistress, in teaching me the alphabet, had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L. I don't know if you've ever heard that saying. This is an example of illusion. I talked about it in the last unit. It's a reference to something famous, a reference to something important. Hey, that reminds me. I want to make sure that you get credit for participation, for watching this video, okay? And so I want you to email me with the password. I'm going to give you the password. And let's see, what we want the password to be, Miss Torres? Something they won't think of. Parallelism. Parrell. Well, something like that. Just send me the word parallelism. Spell it as best you can. I don't know what you mean. In an email.
Can I tell you how it's spelled?
Yeah, how is it spelled?
Parallelism.
Okay, well, you heard it here first. That's how you spell parallelism. So send me that. Send me that in an email, and you'll get your 4 points, participation points, for watching this video. She says here, it's that old saying, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. If I give you just a little bit, you'll take advantage of it. The old version of that saying is, if you give them an inch, they'll take an L. An L was a unit of measurement that's 45 inches. And he says, she gave me the inch and I took the L. She taught me the alphabet and I was ready to go for it. I was ready to learn to read. The plan which I adopted, and the one by which I was most successful, was that of making friends of all little white boys whom I met in the street. As many of these as I could, I converted into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at different times and in different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. When I was sent on errands, I always took my book with me, and by going one part of my errand quickly, I found time to get a lesson before my return. I used also to carry bread with me, enough of which was always in the house, and to which I was always welcome, for I was much better off in this regard than many of the poor white children in our neighborhood. This bread I used to bestow upon the hungry little urchins, who in return would give me that more valuable bread of knowledge. I'm strongly tempted to give the names of 2 or 3 of those boys as a testimonial of the gratitude and affection I bear them, but prudence forbids. So do you see what he's doing here? He's actually, he's learning how to read, and his teachers are these little white boys that he goes out in the street and plays with. And a lot of them are poor, and they don't have much food. Now, he's a slave, but he has access to his master's food. So he takes the bread with him and trades it for learning. He says, here, I'll give you some bread. What, will you show me in this book? How do you read this? I mean, this is amazing when you think about it, that he was willing to do this, that he took all this effort to read. We have so many opportunities to be able to read, and sometimes we don't take those opportunities. I read about a guy. He was not a slave. He lived in Texas. He was a white man, lived in Texas in the late 1800s, and he went to a one-room schoolhouse, but his family could not afford books to read. And he would just go around the classroom to try to read from the other kids' books, and finally the kids were making fun of him, and he couldn't do it anymore. And so the teacher said, well, I'll just leave the window open, cracked, every night. You come into the class and study the textbooks for the next day. And so he would study the textbook every night. He'd sneak in the window of the school, study the textbooks for the next day's lesson. And then the students made fun of him because he had the lesson memorized. So, I guess you can't win, but the point is, he was reading, and he wanted to read. And here, Frederick Douglass was doing anything he could to read. And he talks about these boys that helped him. He says, I'm strongly tempted to give the names of 2 or 3 of those little boys as a testimonial of the gratitude and affection I bear them, but prudence forbids, not that it would injure me, but it might embarrass them. For it is almost an unpardonable offense to teach slaves to read in this Christian country. In other words, he's saying, now that we're all adults, these kids are men in the South. And if their names were published in a book, it would be very embarrassing to know that when they were kids, they taught the famous Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist, the one campaigning against slavery, that they were the ones that taught him to read. It's enough to say of the dear little fellows that they lived on Philpott Street, very near Durgin and Bailey's shipyard. I used to talk this matter of slavery over with them. I would sometimes say to them, I wished I could be as free as they would be when they got to be men. You will be free as soon as you're 21, but I am a slave for life. Have I not as good a right to be free as you have? These words used to trouble them. They would express for me the liveliest sympathy and console me with the hope that something would occur by which I might be free. I was now about 12 years old, and the thought of being a slave for life began to bear heavily upon my heart. Just about this time, I got a hold of a book entitled The Columbian Orator. Every opportunity I got, I used to read this book. Among much of the other interesting matter, I found in it a dialogue between a master and his slave. The slave was represented as having run away from his master 3 times. The dialogue represented the conversation which took place between them when the slave was retaken the 3rd time. In this dialogue, the whole argument in behalf of slavery was brought forward by the master, all of which was disposed of by the slave. The slave was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things in reply to his master, things which had the desired though unexpected effect, for the conversation resulted in the voluntary emancipation of the slave on the part of the master. So he's reading a fictional book. You remember fiction? Some of you always say fiction means fake. It's a made-up story. But he's reading a story about a slave and a master, and the master convinces the slave that slavery is not right, and because of that, he gets his freedom. Probably not very realistic scenario, but Frederick Douglass is affected by the arguments that are given here. There's more. Emancipation, by the way, means freedom. It means getting one's freedom. In the same book, I met with one of Sheridan's mighty speeches on in behalf of Catholic emancipation. What he's talking about is, in England in the 17 and 1800s, Catholics did not have the freedom to vote. They didn't have the freedom to hold office or hold certain kind of property. And so then they were emancipated and got their freedoms. Well, he's reading about their freedoms, and he thinks, I want freedom too. These were choice documents to me. I read them over and over again with unabated interest. They gave me tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, which had frequently flashed through my mind and died away for want of utterance. The moral which I gained from the dialogue was the power of truth over the conscience of even a slaveholder. What I got from Sheridan was a bold denunciation of slavery and a powerful vindication of human rights. The reading of these documents enabled me to utter my thoughts and to meet the arguments brought forward to sustain slavery. But while they relieved me of one difficulty, they brought on another even more painful than the one, from which I was relieved. The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers who had left their homes and gone to Africa and stolen us from our homes, and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. I loathed them as being the meanest as well as the most wicked of men. As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment with which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but no ladder upon which to get out. Do you think fish know that they're in water? Do you think fish know what water is? Sometimes we're in the middle of something. We don't even understand it. We don't even know that it's there. And that's how it was for slavery. Slaves, the people who own slaves, it's just part of their life. And now Frederick Douglass has opened up to a new idea, the idea of freedom. And this idea of freedom is going to completely change his perspective. And it came from a book. It came from reading a book. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. There was no getting rid of it. It was pressed upon me by every object within sight or hearing, animate or inanimate. The silver trump of freedom had aroused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom now appeared to disappear no more forever. It was heard in every sound, seen in everything. It was present to torment me with a sense of my wretched condition. I saw nothing without seeing it. I heard nothing without hearing it, and felt nothing without feeling it. It looked from every star, it smiled in every calm, it breathed in every wind, and moved in every storm. What was it? Freedom. I think about that story of Braveheart. The Scotsmen were fighting against the English, and in the movie version, they put Braveheart on the rack, and they're torturing him, and they want him to cry out for mercy, and instead he cries out one word: freedom. Funny thing is, in history, the English, the Scots, they fought bloody wars to preserve their own freedom. Then they came to America and ended up enslaving others and denying their freedom. Even Thomas Jefferson, who hated slavery, he wrote that he hated slavery. And he literally wrote the words of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. But even he had slaves his whole life. And so people were caught up in this system, and it made good people bad. And it made good people into oppressors. And we're still living with some of those results today. I'll have you, you can reread this if you want to. Go ahead and answer the questions that will be posted on this. Make sure that you email me submit it on Google Classroom rather. Thanks. Talk to you later. Make sure you like, hit subscribe, enable your notifications so you can see all my wonderful videos. Talk to you later.